Continuing the theme of versatile subgenres, let's talk about post-metal. Personally, I dislike when genres are called post-something. For one, it implies that that genre is dead, which isn't always the case. Plus, it's kinda lazy. Oh, it's called post-grunge because it came after grunge. Aye, no shit. Every genre develops from the genres before it. Come up with your own name, you lazy fuds. That being said, I don't name these, so we're stuck with post-metal. At first glance, post-metal seems to just be prog metal, but even weirder. Upon further examination though, progressive metal is about making metal more complex and experimental and evolving it as a genre, while post-metal is about going beyond the boundaries of what metal even is. In prog, they're trying to elevate metal, whereas in post-metal, they're trying to transcend it. Metal is just used as a jumping off point to explore whatever musical ideas a band feels like. It shares the long songs and multiple sections of prog, and there's still fantastic musicianship in post-metal, but that's not focused on the same way it is in prog metal. Post-metal doesn't require odd time signatures or advanced music theory, because sometimes less is more. At times it feels like it's written into law that there has to be a bombastic guitar solo in every prog song, no matter what the song is about. But post-metal bands aren't afraid to take a minimalist approach when it's appropriate.
Last year my brother Fraser took his own life, and the only way I've been able to deal with that is actually through music.
And what's the piece called?
It's called The Empty Room.
Progressive music is obviously a big influence, but post-metal also uses elements of ambient, psychedelic, and even noise at times, and obviously it was heavily inspired by post-rock. Post-metal is generally associated with dark and sad songs, but artists really can do anything they want with it. You'll find all sorts of bizarre stuff under the post-metal label. Now technically, you could take the post-metal approach to any primary subgenre, but post-metal tends to favour doom metal and black metal. I talked about black gaze before, and most of that falls under post-metal. In fact, a lot of stuff does. It's another versatile subgenre where bands really can do whatever they want. Its development is largely credited to Godflesh and Neurosis in the 90s. The former played industrial metal and the latter played sludge, but their unconventional songwriting was very influential over post-metal, with fairly lengthy and atmospheric songs usually avoiding a traditional structure of verses and choruses, often mixing slow, ambient sections with heavy sections. Godflesh were also hugely important in establishing industrial metal as a subgenre, which is something I missed out in my industrial section. In fact, in a previous part I said that Fear Factory are one of the best examples of the industrial metal sound, but honestly, Godflesh really set the blueprint for the genre. Fear Factory are perhaps a good example of a more fast, aggressive style of industrial metal, but Godflesh are the quintessential melancholic and atmospheric industrial, and there's no denying their role in pioneering the genre. Now, people give the black metal community a lot of criticism for the alarming number of Nazis, but I find the post-metal fandom's open support of ISIS just as concerning.
Oh, hang on, I may have made a mistake here.
Yes, the unfortunately named ISIS are one of the most critically acclaimed bands in post-metal. Other bands of note include Pelican, Cult of Luna, Agaloch, and Wolves in the Throne Room. The last two of those fit under black gaze as well. To be honest, there's not a lot more I can say about this one. Its versatility makes it sound very difficult to summarise. Oh, and then there's avant-garde metal, which is just any prog or post-metal bands who are that extra level of pretentious that they need their subgenre to be in French. It's debatable whether post-metal counts as metal. Post-rock is generally considered to be rock, and post-punk is generally considered to be punk, but post-grunge is seen as something completely separate to regular grunge, so it's hard to say. I guess generally I'd say post-metal isn't metal because it's not trying to be. It's trying to be more than that. But there are still bands in the genre that I do think count. So, I'm gonna say the line again. You have to take bands on a case-by-case basis. I think on my subgenres model, post-metal can be considered a branch of the progressive metal family tree. At least it can be using definition A, but I think this model needs revised again. Now, obviously, every metal genre has to have at least some external influences, but I don't want to include subgenres which simply combine existing metal with another type of music. So even if you count metalcore as metal, it doesn't really belong here, and nor does progressive metal for that matter. The idea of primary subgenres is supposed to be like primary colours, in that you need them to make more colours. For instance, if you have a progressive metal band or a post-metal band, you need to pick one or more of these types of metal to make progressive. If you're a metalcore band, you'll be combining a mix of these with hardcore. If you're a folk metal band, you'll be adding folk music to one or more of these. This revised model fits both definitions A and B and anything else on the spectrum between those two extremes. Now, let me emphasise, a subgenre's exclusion from this chart does not mean it's not a real subgenre. It just means that it is made from one or more of these. Purple is its own colour, but you need to combine red and blue to get it. So, we've come full circle back to 6 primary subgenres. Full disclosure, of all the subgenres I've covered in this series, post-metal was the one I knew the least about before looking into it, so I hope I've done it justice. Now then, let's talk about another subgenre that relies on the primary subgenres. Now we move on to folk metal, which I had previously just skimmed over because it's so self-explanatory, but it's been around for a long time and has a dedicated fandom, so it's worth looking at its history. And honestly, I'm glad I decided to cover this in more detail because a lot of this stuff is fascinating. As I said before, folk metal is obviously a mix of metal and folk music. Usually, this is the folk music of whatever country the band is from. Although obviously there'd be nothing stopping an American folk metal band from playing Portuguese folk if they wanted to. A lot of the time, folk guitar melodies are played through classic heavy metal distortion, and this is often accompanied by traditional folk instruments like flutes, violins, bagpipes, accordions, hurdy-gurdies, or keyboards made to sound like folk instruments. Combining these elements with metal creates folk metal, but the specifics of the metal side of things can vary. Most commonly, folk metal uses heavy metal and power metal, but it can and does get combined with other subgenres. This means that it has a variety of vocal styles. Now, folk tends to be catchy and melodic, so clean vocals are the most common, but harsh vocal styles are also incorporated sometimes. Not only is there a wide variety of vocal styles, there's also a wide variety of languages. In fact, while plenty of subgenres have big international success, folk metal is probably the most multilingual of all the subgenres. Remember how I said that Norway is thought of as the land of black metal, and Sweden is thought of as the land of death metal? Well, Finland isn't just the home of death metal where the vocals are burped, it's also the home of folk metal. As for Denmark, I guess you guys have Merciful Fate and King Diamond going for you? Plus Lars Ulrich! I'm so sorry, Denmark. If you take any folk metal band, there's a good chance they're Finnish. The origins of folk metal, however, are credited to the English band Skyclad. They initially played thrash metal, but started to incorporate violins on their 1991 album, The Wayward Sons of Mother Earth. They then hired a fiddler into the band, as in the kind that plays a fiddle, not the kind that works for the BBC. At the time, combining metal with non-metal instruments was a novel concept only really used in prog, but it started to catch on a bit more. Throughout the 90s, a few bands incorporated other folk instruments and melodies into their style, sometimes only temporarily. Folk metal wasn't really popularised until the late 90s and early 2000s, as Fintroll became very successful for their niche. Their songs are mostly troll themed, not in the online sense, and I'll give you one guess as to where they're from. Bizarrely, most of the songs are in Swedish, partly because the vocalist is part of a minority of Swedish-speaking Finns, but the kayfabe explanation is that Swedish sounds more like a troll language. Okay then. They combine death metal with polka, of all things, and I guess the sheer boldness of that combination blew the doors open for eccentric bands to incorporate whatever goofy folk ideas they liked into their music. Folk metal went from a trickle of new bands in the 90s to a rapid multiplication in the 2000s. It's not exactly chart-topping, but it's more popular than you might expect. There are multiple folk metal festivals. The bands tend to be from Europe, and the lyrics are usually about folk mythology, nature, paganism, and drinking. In fact, one of Korpiglani's best known songs is about chugging vodka, and the other is about chugging beer, the latter of which has been covered by various bands in all sorts of other European languages. Other folk metal bands of note include Moonsorrow, Ensiferum, Heilung, and Skalmild. There are a few American bands, although rather than playing their local folk music, which would probably end up being a fusion of country and metal, they tend to use European folk like the other bands do. One of the better known American folk metal bands is Agaloch, a band I mentioned already in post metal. They're a band of many labels: post metal, folk metal, black gaze, collecting all the name tags. Undoubtedly, the most popular folk metal band in recent memory is Ailstorm. Their memorable pirate gimmick certainly helped them, but it's clear from the several far less popular pirate-themed bands out there that the gimmick alone isn't what brought them success. They took the cheesy, fun sound of power metal and combined it with the catchiness of sea shanties and folk music to create singable and danceable party metal. Take that sound and make humorous songs in English about pirates, and in hindsight it was a pretty ingenious idea for a band. There are plenty of folk metal bands with a similar sound, but their songs are usually in non-English languages and are often about obscure folklore that you would only know about if you're from their country. Meanwhile, by some massive coincidence, far more people speak English, including people from non-English speaking countries, and everyone knows about pirates. So it's no surprise that Ailstorm got as big as they are now. I have friends with no interest in metal whatsoever who still put on drink at parties. It's uncanny. Folk metal has of course led to its own variations. Many of these are regional depending on the local folk music of wherever the band are from. So Celtic metal obviously takes influence from Irish and Scottish folk music. And like the other regional variations, where the band are from tends to coincide with the kind of folk music that they incorporate, but the bands themselves don't actually need to be from that region. For example, one of the better known Celtic metal bands is Helveti, who are from Switzerland. The regional variations are fairly self-explanatory, so I won't go into those. Medieval metal originates from a German folk rock band called Subway to Sally, who started incorporating medieval instruments and melodies into their blend of hard rock and heavy metal folk music. So lutes, bagpipes, mandolins, hurdy-gurdies, and other medieval instruments playing medieval melodies alongside metal riffs makes up the medieval metal variation. Then we have Viking metal. I've previously said that I don't consider this to be a real subgenre, but some people do, so it's worth explaining anyway. There are Viking-themed metal bands, such as Amon Amarth, who do not incorporate folk into their music, so they would not actually fall under this category. They would just be a melodeath band who make songs about Vikings. Viking metal is a mix of Scandinavian folk music with metal, usually first wave black metal specifically, on top of the lyrics being about Vikings. This specific combo is a result of Bathory. After their first 3 albums pioneered what black metal would look and sound like, their 4th album changed things up and used their harsh, dark sound to make songs about Vikings at war. Blood, Fire, Death is still celebrated by fans of black metal, thrash metal, and Viking metal, but their follow-ups got a bit more controversial. Hammerheart and Twilight of the Gods aren't particularly well regarded by black metal fans, but Bathory diving into Norse mythology encouraged the introduction of black metal into folk metal, and led to many bands writing about Odin. The best known Viking metal band is Tuir. Hailing from the Faroe Islands, sitting between Scotland and Iceland, this band is named after the Norse god of war. Yeah, that's right, dipshits. It's not Kratos. I think you'll find he's the Greek god of war. They play both metal riffs and folk melodies on their guitars, along with some very catchy choruses. Their songs are naturally about Vikings, Norse mythology, and paganism. Most of their songs are in English, but there are occasional lyrics in Faroese. Some of you might have raised an eyebrow at the Nordic runes, which I would say seems a tad paranoid, but given the issues with Nazism in black metal and folk metal lyrics often portraying an idealised version of the past, it's an understandable concern. Refreshingly, Tuir have quite explicitly condemned Nazis appropriating Norse symbols. And good on them. Runes are cool and they don't belong to cunts. Now, in my opinion, Viking metal is an unnecessary category. It seems like Viking metal bands are, for the most part, just folk metal bands who write about Vikings. Perhaps I think that because I'm not deep into folk metal and the distinction doesn't matter to me, but that's my take. And of course, you have variations based on which kind of metal is being infused with folk music. One thing I will say about heavier variations of folk metal is that the upbeat tone and tempo that it's known for isn't necessary, and there does exist some more melancholic folk metal out there. I'll use the example of my own favourite band within the folk metal umbrella, combining Scottish folk instruments with atmospheric black metal to create some beautiful, sombre music. I might be a tad biased in favour of this one, although I don't know how to pronounce the name of this particular solo project since I don't speak Scottish Gaelic. In fact, just over 1% of Scotland's population even does, so it's very difficult to find out how to pronounce anything. I looked through Wikipedia's little IPA guide to pronunciation, so I'll try my best. Sur. Folk metal wasn't included in my subgenres model because any folk metal band is a mix of one of these and the external non-metal influence of folk music, so there's not much point in giving it its own heading here. Here's a quick side note, if you count The Who as metal, then this is the subgenre they would fit in. More specifically, I guess folk heavy metal or perhaps folk groove metal when they use distortion, although even their undistorted stuff sounds pretty metal in the style of riffs. If you want to call The Who metal, that's your prerogative. I personally wouldn't, and would instead categorise them as Mongolian folk rock. Returning to the idea of fun metal, let's talk about black and roll and death and roll.
Thank you very much. Rock and roll! Rock and roll! Rock and roll! Rock and roll! Here we go!
As you've probably guessed, these subgenres combine metal's more extreme subgenres with old school rock and roll. Johnny be bad, am I right? The result is groovy and bluesy, but for the most part it still maintains the heaviness and atmosphere of the respective metal genres. Death and roll came first, as Swedish death metal legends Entombed took on a groovier style on their album Wolverine Blues. They retained their thick, heavy guitar tone and death growls, but slowed down the drums a bit. Now, groovy death metal is nothing new, and even particularly extreme bands like to slow things down on occasion, but specifically implementing a bluesy sound was something a little different. Entombed weren't deliberately trying to create a new approach, but Wolverine Blues and some of Entombed's output after that album provided the initial inspiration. This, combined with some bluesy tracks from Carcass and Gorefest, encouraged the development of this micro-genre, and there have been quite a few bands whose entire sound follows this fusion of rock and roll and death metal, including Hell Train and Debauchery, to just name a couple. 6 Feet Under also deserves some credit for implementing some bluesy rock and roll to their sound, including them doing death metal covers of classic rock songs. Sadly, that's not what they're remembered for. Black and roll is the same idea, but with black metal, with a lot of bands feeling inspired by black metal's rocky roots and venom. Sometimes the production is clear, and sometimes it's raw, but consistently, bluesy, evil riffs are played with black metal's signature shrieks over the top of them. Some credit has to go to Darkthrone, who, after losing interest in the black metal scene for obvious reasons, just kinda did whatever they felt like on each album, incorporating punk, doom, and sometimes rock and roll. Other established black metal bands, namely Satyricon and Carpathian Forest, have also experimented with the sound. But once again, there are plenty of bands entirely based around this fusion, such as Bunker 66 and Midnight, the latter of whom cross over into black and speed metal. There's quite a bit of overlap between black and speed and black and roll depending on how fast a band likes to play. Speed metal has had a revival since it was originally overshadowed by thrash in the 80s. Nowadays, speed metal provides the speed of thrash, but with just the sound of heavy metal and little in the way of punk or hardcore influences. Alongside Midnight, there's Speedwolf and my personal favourite, Hellripper. For all of black metal's Satan worship, I think black and roll is specifically the music Satan would actually listen to, because it sounds evil, but it also sounds like the band is having fun, and I can just picture demons dancing around a fire to it. Of course, I can't talk about black and roll without talking about the one band that has reached mainstream success. Kvelertak lean more towards the roll side of black and roll, but the black metal elements are still there, with shrieking vocals and the occasional blast beat. Their emphasis on the roll side of things makes their sound more accessible, and as such, for all their shrieking, their music doesn't sound too out of place at a party. They're popular enough to tour and collaborate with Mastodon, and the one time I saw Metallica live, they were the support act. Their recent output has further softened their sound, with use of clean vocals and less emphasis on the black metal parts, but their first few albums are, for the moment, the peak of commercial success for black and roll. It is for this reason that black metal fans hate them now. And with all that covered, I turn over to my audience's requests for what to cover. I'll go over the most popular requests in order of popularity, and once we get to very obscure stuff that only one person asked for, I'll be skimming it for time. So, next time, we'll start with symphonic metal. But until then, that'll do for part 10. See you next time. Hello everyone, before we start, I'd like to give a quick disclaimer. Throughout this entire series, any praise of a band or acknowledgement of their influence is not an endorsement of the artists as people or of any of their opinions. I figured after giving a lot of attention to Ailstorm in the last episode, I couldn't really move on without at least addressing the elephant in the room. With that out of the way, we now return to your irregular, not even remotely scheduled programming. Like I said at the end of the last episode, I'm now going to turn over to my audience's requests, going over the most popular requests in order of popularity and descending down until we get to the really obscure stuff that barely anyone asked for, which I'll be skimming for time, assuming I feel I have anything to add. Also keep in mind, not every request will be covered. With that out of the way, let's start with symphonic metal. Once again, this is an incredibly self-explanatory subgenre, which is versatile enough to be combined with any other metal subgenre. Symphonic metal is a lot like folk metal in that it takes symphonic instruments and symphonic songwriting and blends it with metal. The typical metal sound is accompanied and complemented by strings, brass instruments, choirs, and other orchestral music, while the riffs and other melodies on the guitars tend to sound like a metal cover of an epic orchestral film score. In essence, symphonic metal is the metal subgenre for people who only listen to video game soundtracks. And it works! The genre is very popular by metal standards and is able to appeal to dedicated and casual metal fans alike. It's also very versatile, as the symphonic elements can be applied to any subgenre, from power to death to black. As a general rule, the production tends to be very good, because if you're going to go to the bother of including orchestration, the ship has already sailed on having a raw sound. An initial inspiration for the subgenre was Celtic Frost, pioneers of first wave black metal, who implemented some symphonic elements on their 1987 album Into the Pandemonium. This was just 1 year before they went into an utterly inexplicable hair metal phase, so it's no surprise that they were in an experimental mood at the time. There were other bands who occasionally implemented some symphonic elements, including some of the bands who I mentioned in the gothic metal section, but a lot of credit belongs to Therion, who accompanied their music with a live orchestra. And keep in mind, all of these developments predate Metallica's S&M album, so that album didn't so much develop the genre as it did draw attention to it and generate interest. Then, in 1997, 3 of the subgenre's biggest names released their first albums. These were Nightwish, Rhapsody of Fire, and Within Temptation. Nightwish and Within Temptation are both extremely popular, owing to the fact that both feature clean female vocals, which make them very palatable to mainstream audiences, and it sets them apart from most bands. Nightwish are among the symphonic metal bands who utilise operatic lead vocals, which are impressive by the standards of any music genre, let alone metal. Nightwish combined the symphonic sound with power metal and a little bit of folk sometimes. Within Temptation started out playing symphonic doom, but have a more broad range of metal sounds now combined with their symphonic sound. Both Nightwish and Within Temptation are also included in the ranks of gothic metal. Rhapsody of Fire fit very comfortably under symphonic power metal, and personally, I think power metal is the most fitting for a symphonic sound, with its lyrics of grand adventures and its sweeping tone. It just works. As I mentioned, there are heavier subgenres which also get the symphonic treatment. The biggest names in symphonic death are Flesh God Apocalypse and Septic Flesh, and the biggest name in symphonic black metal is Dimmu Borgir, although you could arguably count Cradle of Filth in there too. There's something moving on a primal level about combining symphonic instrumentation with blast beats. It creates a fascinating juxtaposition of brutality and harmony as the symphonic instruments simultaneously enhance the intensity and provide a more melodic contrast. The origins of symphonic black metal, and arguably also symphonic death metal, can be traced back to Emperor with their album In the Nightside Eclipse, which utilised symphonic elements to enhance their already dense atmosphere. And I say this may have had an influence on symphonic death because, well, this is one of the earliest examples of combining that symphonic sound with a more extreme subgenre. Emperor also managed to provide a very rare example of utilising a raw production style within symphonic metal. For fans of metalcore, symphonic metalcore bands do exist. The rising star of that particular combo is the symphonic deathcore band Shadow of Intent. The result is a similar sound to symphonic death metal, but with a hardcore beatdown style of riffs, and of course plenty of breakdowns. Symphonic metal is not a subgenre which I've listened to a lot, but the combination of big riffs and orchestral scores is, in the proper sense of the word, epic. It's such an effective combination of styles that I'm not even remotely surprised by its popularity, and I think the bands all deserve the success they've achieved. A lot of the bands in this subgenre provide an excellent starting point for beginners, whether it's people who didn't like any metal appreciating the film score-like quality of the music, or fans of lighter forms of metal who find the more extreme subgenres palatable when it's in a symphonic form. Symphonic is ultimately another highly versatile modifier for the primary subgenres. The second most requested subgenre I got is Nintendo Core.
Oh my god!
This one has already been covered in painstaking detail by Pagefire, so if you're interested I would recommend checking that video out. But for the abridged version, Nintendo Core is a mix of late 2000s metalcore with 8-bit music. At least, that's where the name comes from, but it's often used as an umbrella term for various video game themed metal or metal adjacent bands. It's pretty much a complete joke of a genre, to the point that the community likes to celebrate one of the worst songs produced within the genre by all doing different covers of it. If we focus on the more specific kind of Nintendo core, combining metalcore and 8-bit melodies, then it's fairly obvious that this subgenre is very much a product of its time. Nostalgia has always been a big part of internet culture, but specifically nostalgia for 8-bit stuff was huge in the mid to late 2000s, with the angry video game nerd and his countless imitators dominating video content. The metalcore part is just because that's what was popular at the time. If it started out in the late 90s, it would probably be Nintendo, and if it came out now, it would probably just be some Bring Me the Horizon knockoffs, but they found a way to make the annoying noises that band agonizingly contorts into melodies even more fucking annoying. It's wild to me that people will say they can't get into Darkthrone and then listen to this by choice.
Make it stop!
This subgenre was very clearly only requested for the meme. It's silly, it's gimmicky, and no one takes it very seriously, including the musicians who make it. I'm certainly not the right audience for Nintendo core. Don't get me wrong, I also like old video games, and given the trajectory of the games industry, I think I'll stick to old games until the inevitable day when a publisher tries to add sex-trafficked human cargo loot boxes to their live service, and the industry finally gets regulated to a point where AAA games feel like video games again and not a soul-crushing second job you never stop paying for. But I never grew up with Nintendo stuff. The old games I like are boomer shooters, which already cross over into metal quite nicely. Plus, as I've said, I find 8-bit music incredibly grating to listen to. I know that's rich coming from a black metal enjoyer, but it's the truth. So this is definitely not a subgenre for me. Notable bands include I Am Error, Crystal Castles, the NES Eskimos, and Mini Bosses. Frequently included in the ranks of Nintendo core is Power Glove, who do metal covers of old video game music, but they don't have anything to do with chiptunes or metalcore. Before I move on, since Nintendo core can be used more broadly to include any metal and metalcore about video games, does that mean Shadow of Intense Halo-inspired stuff counts as Nintendo core? I'll let you decide. The next request is mathcore and math rock. Strictly speaking, this isn't metal, but math metal does exist, so I might as well explain its roots. I'll focus on mathcore because that's closer to metal. The math part refers to all the complicated numbers from time signature changes, rhythms, structures, and a whole lot more technical stuff that I don't understand music theory enough to explain. This results in very chaotic and unpredictable music. The influences on this genre can be traced as far back as King Crimson, as technicality and experimentation are a natural part of prog. Then bands like Foals, The Dismemberment Plan, and Tricot focused more on the aspects that would define math rock in future, further developing the highly technical style. Then mathcore came along, combining said sound with hardcore. This created frantic, aggressive playing that managed to draw frequent comparisons to jazz. It effectively expressed the anger of hardcore punk through the technicality of math rock, with at least a little bit of metal in there as well. When it comes to lyrics, generally speaking, the songs don't tend to be focused on explicitly political topics as one might expect from hardcore. Mathcore bands are instead more likely to focus on personal issues. Notable mathcore bands include Converge, the Dillinger Escape Plan, and Botch, though there are of course many others. There are definitely heavier kinds of music out there, but few genres can capture the same kind of manic intensity that you get from mathcore. The result is often exhausting to listen to. Something mathcore is infamous for is live performances that display the kind of craziness that the music evokes. Most mathcore bands don't do this, but that's not what people are going to remember. Instead, they're going to remember Coalesce and the Dillinger Escape Plan starting fights, dangling off things, throwing instruments, and breathing fire. The most infamous incident is worthy of a thumbs up out of G.G. Allen's grave, as Dillinger's frontman, Greg Puciato, treated Reading Festival to the sight of him shitting into a bag, throwing it into the crowd, and smearing someone himself. This literal shit-flinging was explicitly intended to show his disapproval of the other bands playing at the festival. Since he proved you can get a lot of attention and praise from contrarians by behaving like an incontinent toddler because music you dislike exists, in a way he was kind of a pioneer for the online metal community. There is of course math metal, but this mostly refers to gent. So rather than the anarchic noise of mathcore, the most popular way to do math metal is in a far more orderly, robotic style, although gent can still sometimes get chaotic as well. Next up, some people wanted a little more detail on crossover thrash. Crossover thrash refers to bands that fuse hardcore and thrash metal. These two genres are already quite similar, so they're a good pairing. Suicidal Tendencies are credited with pioneering the genre, but there are a lot of bands that fall into this category. Some lean more towards the hardcore side of things, like Cro-Mags and Agnostic Front, so they're hardcore bands with a thrash sound, and some lean more into thrash, like Sod and Nuclear Assault, so they're thrash bands with a hardcore sound. Like I said, these genres were already similar, so bands I've mentioned before like Municipal Waste, DRI and Power Trip are often included in this category as well. Other bands of note include Cryptic Slaughter, Biohazard and even Body Count, who are better known for being a rap metal band, but the metal side of their sound is very thrashy with quite a lot of hardcore influences. Despite their rap metal trappings, they certainly aren't nu metal and predate that particular trend by quite a few years. Again, there's not a lot left to say about this one. The lyrical motifs are corporations suck and beer rules, the music is fast but often slows down into groovy sections, and of course the drumming utilises the D beat, also known as the discharge beat, named after the pioneering punk band who popularised it and who were a huge influence on both thrash and hardcore. Up next, some people requested that I explain the history of power metal since I omitted that in my power metal section. That's a fair request, so let's go. When thrash metal first came about, some people looked at British heavy metal and thought, "We love this fast, aggressive stuff. Make it faster and cut out those cheesy parts and it'll be perfect." Meanwhile, other people listened to it and thought, "We love the epic tone and silly parts, let's make it faster and even cheesier." And thus, power metal was born. As I explained way back in part 2, power metal has a lighter and more uplifting sound. While thrash was too mean to be mainstream, power metal was too nerdy. Dio rightly gets credit for inspiring power metal, particularly through his work in Rainbow. Heavy metal that leaned into high fantasy concepts was obviously a major influence. Rob Halford's vocals in Judas Priest set the blueprint for the high-pitched, dramatic singing, and Iron Maiden encouraged bands to go for an anthemic sound. I think Iron Maiden are about as close to power metal as heavy metal gets, and I think you could argue that they're proto-power metal, but I still think they count as heavy metal instead. In the United States, bands like Savatage and Kirith Ungol are credited with pushing heavy metal further in this direction, and Manowar did so much to push the sound in that direction that some people argue that they were the first power metal band. But I think the first band to solidify the power metal sound was Germany's Helloween, with the release of Keeper of the Seven Keys Part 1 in 1987. They took all the aforementioned elements and pushed them over the edge of heavy metal into a sound distinct enough to be identified as a new subgenre. Germany actually produced quite a lot of important power metal bands like Running Wild, Blind Guardian, and the Scotaboos known as Gravedigger. The European sound developed further in the 90s with a focus on creating epic atmospheres and the introduction of keyboards along with other symphonic elements. European power metal is sometimes called second wave power metal as its developments give it a different sound to the earlier sound of the 80s. American power metal focuses more on this first wave style, relying on traditional speed and heavy metal tropes to create their epic sounds. As such, American power metal is often heavier than European, and sometimes bands like Iced Earth blur the line between power and thrash. It's important to note that many bands from the US have used this European style and vice versa. These styles aren't exclusive to any continent, they're just named after where they're developed. Very occasionally, power metal is combined with heavier subgenres, such as Children of Bodom's blend of power metal and melodeath, and if you're in the mood for hot takes, Amon Amarth's output from Twilight of the Thunder God onwards is also ultra angry power metal with death growls. And that was power metal, chugging along in its own niche, not bothering anyone. Too light for extreme metal fans, but too metal for mainstream rock success. But suddenly, seemingly overnight in the mid-2000s, it was catapulted into the spotlight in an event which I believe created what can be considered the third wave of power metal, bringing in legions of new fans and dividing veterans. In October 2007, Guitar Hero 3 hit the shelves, and gamers became obsessed with the hardest song in the game, Through the Fire and Flames by Dragon Force. It was crazy and over the top, but not too heavy for newcomers. A lot of new fans emerged from Guitar Hero 3 in search of a similar sound, and as history would prove, they weren't necessarily looking for something just as technical, but they did want more ridiculous, over-the-top music. And thus, power metal entered its third wave, the meme era. Power metal bands' success quickly became determined by eye-catching gimmicks that people were likely to share online. And be honest, if you're confronted with either one of many similar bands writing classic power metal songs about the usual topics, or a band that sings about Catholic werewolves, you're gonna click on the latter, no matter how much effort the former puts into songwriting. Which is not to say that gimmicky bands don't put effort into their songs. Yes, a lot of popular tropes are used for mass appeal, but writing a catchy, memorable song is a lot easier said than done. Still, the gimmicks are what brought these bands attention initially. As this went on, lots of bands had some kind of crazy gimmick, and at that point it's hard to stand out. So this led to an arms race of ridiculous gimmicks, as to this day, bands still try to out-goofy each other to grab the spotlight. I'm not really into power metal, so I enjoy the surface level gimmicks when I'm in the mood for it, but I can also understand why a lot of power metal purists are really fed up with the scene. Power metal was always a bit silly, but at this point, modern mainstream power metal has become a parody of itself, which some people are perfectly happy with, but others are sick of having to scour the depths of Bandcamp to find their idea of what power metal should be. If you ask me, I predict that in response to this, we're long overdue for a new wave of old school power metal bands. Kind of like this next request. The new wave of traditional heavy metal, or no of them, started in the late 90s. Ever since Venom inspired multiple subgenres for metal to branch out into, heavy metal was still very successful, with Priest and Maiden touring the world in big stadiums, but it had largely been abandoned by die-hard metal fans, excitedly chasing after the latest developments in heaviness. In the 90s, the subgenres got heavier and darker, to the point where it was becoming a bit too much for fans of the classic sound. Meanwhile, groove metal had taken over the mainstream, and this is conjecture on my part, but I believe the tipping point was nu metal. That's when some bands said, "Fuck this, metal doesn't sound like metal anymore. Reject modernity, embrace tradition, return to Maiden." And they did exactly that, but with the benefit of hindsight, so they could combine all the best elements of the old school heavy metal sound and ignore some of the blunders of early experimentation. Now, you might be wondering how to tell the difference between this and power metal, and I would say power metal is a bit faster and more over the top. One quick way to figure it out is ask yourself, could I imagine a biker listening to this? If you can, it's heavy metal. If you can't, it's power metal. Traditional heavy metal has an unmistakably 80s sound, even if it's written and recorded now, whereas power metal sounds like it could come out at pretty much any time. Those are very general rules, but they should help. The band that's most frequently credited with kicking off this movement is Wolf, not to be confused with a new wave of British heavy metal band from Carlisle with the exact same name. They released their self-titled debut in 2000 with some unconventional album art. Yeah, laugh at that album art all you want. If you give it a listen, you'll find the riffs will pull your giant nu metal jeans clean over your head and kick you down the stairs for daring to abandon the ways of the 80s. Other bands in this revival include Bullet, Enforcer, Cauldron, and Ambush, but there are of course many more. Some might call this derivative and simply cashing in on nostalgia, but that's really not the case. When the new wave of traditional heavy metal started, there was really no demand for it. The bands just did it out of their love for the classic sound. The scene is looking a bit healthier now, but it's still not popular. If you want to cash in on old school heavy metal nostalgia, you pretty much have to actually be an old school heavy metal band. As such, I have great respect for these new wave of traditional heavy metal bands soldiering on and playing what they want on their terms. And now we've really reached the bottom of the content barrel. The following requests were not very popular, but I'll quickly cover them just to clear everything up. Neue Deutsche Härte, or New German Hardness, refers to a musical movement in Germany and Austria which started in the 90s. It broadly covers a specific flavour of industrial rock and industrial metal. So next time someone tells you a band isn't metal because they're NDH, they are talking out their fucking arse. The term was first coined in the music press after the release of Rammstein's debut album in 1995, but Oomph are credited with pioneering the sound the year before. It refers to a mix of electronic and/or techno music with alt and groove metal and even a bit of hardcore. A lot of different music gets mixed together to make it. The songs are mostly in German and the vocals are usually clean, although harsher vocals are sometimes used. A lot of vocalists in this genre were fond of overpronouncing everything, rolling every R like Peter Steele on National Talk Like a Pirate Day. Alongside Rammstein, bands like Oomph, Megahertz, and Eisbrecher continued the musical movement. Once again, it's a case-by-case thing, but I don't think it's unreasonable to count a lot of it as industrial metal, but that's my opinion. Dark metal is an incredibly vague subgenre that people can't even agree on the legitimacy of, but if we assume that it's real, it is named after the album Dark Metal by Bethlehem and combines black, doom, and gothic metal, with a little bit of symphonic in there as well. It's a term I see get used very rarely, and we already have gothic doom and gothic black, so it seems kinda redundant. Then again, perhaps gothic black and symphonic doom is a bit of a mouthful, so maybe this name does have its place. Metal step, or death step, is a mix of metal and dubstep. There are a lot of remixes of existing metal songs, but there are some original songs too. This one definitely isn't metal if you ask me. To me, it sounds like dubstep taking metal influences rather than the other way round. But it was requested, so I might as well give my take. Similarly, trap metal is a misnomer. It should really be called metal trap, because it's primarily trap music with some elements of metal. Claiming that it's metal is like saying a strawberry flavoured wine gum is a fucking fruit. Now, good for these artists incorporating metal into their music. Absolutely go for it, and if them doing so gets their fans interested in metal, I say the more the merrier, on you come, but I really don't think it counts. As I covered in my stoner metal section, most of it is sludgy Sabbath worship, but it doesn't have to be. That specific sound is known as stoner doom, but stoner metal can take on other subgenres as long as they keep talking about drugs. A good example would be Cannabis Corpse, who play death metal, and naturally it's all about weed, making pot-related puns with titles of classic death metal songs. Theoretically, I could start my own black metal band and call it Blunt House Nord, and it would probably count as stoner metal, as long as the guitar tone's fuzzy enough. Unsurprisingly, the genre is quite laid back about these things. Speaking of doom, a variation I failed to mention is epic doom. This takes the classic doom metal sound and utilises dramatic heavy metal vocals to sing about fantastical things. It still has a slow, ominous edge to it, but it doesn't sound as depressing as doom usually does. It was pretty much invented by Candlemas, who remain a textbook example of the genre. Other bands include Solstice, Sorcerer, and Procession. If you like the slow, heavy riffs of doom, but you also want the fantastical elements of heavy and power metal, then this is the variation for you. It's slow and heavy, but more empowering than depressing. I might as well throw in another correction while we're here. I realised that I spent too long joking about drone metal back in part 1, and I never explained the appeal. The wall of noise that I talked about can provide a very effective atmosphere. It's essentially really loud ambient music, and if you keep an open mind, you might find yourself enjoying it. Looking back, it may have come across like I was just dismissing the whole thing, like it's all just noise or something. I mean, it is noise, and it often blurs the line between noise and music quite deliberately, but it's definitely art, and it's not just a gimmick. It may seem odd to most people, but it can and does move people. Well, maybe not literally. Lastly, since a couple of you asked nicely, let's take a look at a few regional variations of thrash metal. Teutonic thrash refers to German thrash. It's a bit less political and more focused on lyrics about violence and war. Then again, both of those are pretty political. The sound is much darker, really leaning into the most aggressive aspects of the subgenre. The German thrash scene was vibrant enough to even have its own big four. These are Creator, Destruction, Sodom, and Tankard. I would say Creator and Destruction are the Megadeth and Metallica. I'll let you decide on which is which there. Then Sodom is the German Slayer, since they were a big influence on the development of black metal. And Tankard are obviously the Anthrax, because they're the one everyone forgets about. Canadian thrash was also a thing. From what I've listened to, Canadian thrash doesn't seem to have one consistent sound like Teutonic thrash tends to. It's a bit more varied. Annihilator and Anvil have some old school heavy metal sensibilities, while Razor is pretty extreme by thrash standards. Anvil were actually a very important inspiration for many far more successful thrash bands. There's a very good documentary about them, and it feels like a real version of Spinal Tap at times. They have the passion and enthusiasm, but frankly, they come across as thick as mince and lacking in any self-awareness, so they didn't get very far. They have some wonderful album art though, and of course, Brazilian thrash was a thriving and deeply passionate movement. Aside from Sepultura, most bands from this scene aren't well known internationally, but the extremity of this scene was pivotal in the development of black metal and death metal in the 80s. And now we come to the end. A rough guide to metal subgenres was always meant as an explanation of subgenres to give people the basics they need to navigate all the jargon and find bands that they'll enjoy. At this point, I think I've given more than enough information to achieve that goal. I'm aware there will always be other, increasingly niche microgenres left to cover, and I don't doubt there will be some more corrections to make in future, but this is where I want to definitively end the series. In the distant future, I do plan to make more videos about metal, but I think I've taken this particular series as far as it should go. It's been a bumpy road with some pretty major mistakes, but I hope that those have shown how unsteady a lot of these definitions can be.
We're doing all we can, but I'm not Jesus Christ. I've come to accept that now.
Should always be ready to adapt to changing terminology and keep in mind how arbitrary the lines between genres really are. So hopefully now you, the viewer, are equipped with the basic knowledge of each subgenre that you would need to get into them. But there's still lots more to discover. Maybe you've realised you like death metal, and in a few years you'll get so deep into it that you can tell the differences between Finnish and Swedish death metal just from the riffs. There's always more to learn beneath the surface. I suppose before I leave you to your journeys through metal, I might as well give you some advice for navigating the metal community. Firstly, do not be turned off of a band just because their fans are dicks. I'm willing to bet a lot of dicks listen to your current favourite band. If you receive an angry paragraph from someone who's really miffed that you enjoy insert mainstream band, and you should instead be listening to insert old band, disregard all the insults and give that older band a go anyway. Arseholes sometimes have good taste. Don't stop listening to whichever band they were giving you shit for though. Secondly, the word poser has long since lost all meaning, so do not try and argue with any accusations of poserdom. It's like if someone calls you a dickhead and then you start arguing saying, actually, you can clearly see that my head is not a penis. It's just a meaningless insult that gets hurled at every opportunity, so it's pointless arguing about it. To give you a bit of Cartesian wisdom, your mental states are only accessible to you, meaning that only you can know whether you sincerely enjoy metal, and no one else has any idea. So if you like metal, you already know you do. Do not let anyone make you feel insecure about this. Thirdly, and I would like to emphasise this one quite a bit since I've helped share some knowledge here, do not use your knowledge of metal to be a dick to beginners. We were all that clueless kid at some point. Help people out and correct people when they're wrong, politely, but don't be hostile unless it's really called for. The online metal community is already needlessly confrontational, so please don't make that problem any worse. Fourthly, and frankly this applies to any music fandom, not just metal, do not try to forcibly convert everyone to your good taste. Now, I'll use good taste as a figure of speech, but no such thing actually exists. If someone likes Nickelback, they're not waiting for you to save them. Give them recommendations if they're interested, or if you genuinely think they might like it. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but don't view others' tastes as something you can correct. Fifthly, don't expect to like everything on your first listen. Sometimes it can take several listens to appreciate a new sound. A lot of extreme metal is an acquired taste. In my own experience, I didn't understand black metal at all until early 2019, when on what must have been my fourth attempt at listening to Darkthrone, something just clicked, and suddenly the production went from an annoying distraction to a source of enjoyment from how raw and nasty it sounds. So, keep an open mind and be willing to give subgenres a second or third chance before you dismiss them. And lastly, never try to flex the heaviness of your music taste, because there's always something heavier out there, and the fans of that heavier thing will see you as an absolute clown. And with that, I will let you leave the nest and explore metal on your own terms. I've enjoyed making this series, but I believe it has very much run its course now. I learned a lot making this, and even discovered some new bands for myself while exploring the various subgenres. I plan to make more videos about metal sometime in the distant future, but I doubt that'll happen very soon or with much consistency. Thank you all for watching and coming back time and time again despite the long gaps between videos, and thank you for staying pretty calm about my mistakes throughout the series. I made a playlist on Spotify which has all of the songs featured in this series in order of appearance, even ones that play for less than a second. There will be a link to that in the description. I'm Perg, and that was a rough guide to metal subgenres.
Metal screamed back then.